Community University Research Alliance project called APCO, the Anti-Poverty Community Organizing and Learning project, which is looking at how communities are organizing to address issues of low income or experiences of low income in Toronto. The survey that we have done, this is a survey that we did in 2001, involved 485 respondents, 8 neighborhoods in Toronto, was done in 5 languages. 3 questions. How and why do people participate or get involved in forms of anti-poverty action? 2 is, what is it that is responsible for people stopping to be involved in anti-poverty action? And the 3rd one is, why do some people remain uninvolved in anti-poverty action? Okay, so it's a collaborative participatory action research. We used 4 pillars in trying to explain what are the areas of quote-unquote anti-poverty action that we were looking at. So we're looking at health, nutrition, and food security, housing and safe shelter, education, and access to employment. A really interesting finding is that the predominant way in which people get involved is not through the internet or through people making calls to them or through posters or flyers. It is by friends introducing them to the action. Where do they get involved? Community centers are the predominant, apartment buildings are predominant, but also religious institutions are significant. Motivation for involvement, want to make change.
Hi, thank you all for having me here today. I just want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Mississauga Indigenous peoples, and thank you for including me. And I have to say, I say that a lot. At Ryerson, I'm always saying to somebody, thank you for including me, either in research or events or social things. I have never worked in a place that has been so inclusive, and not just the token inclusive things, so one Indigenous person gets to sit on a committee, but all of these things, you know, research and mentorship and all of these experiences. It's extremely important, all of the research that you're doing. As people are speaking, I can see all of the intersectionalities, all of the ways in which they relate, especially on Indigenous research. I'm currently the chair in Indigenous governance, and as the chair, I have a certain mandate, one of which is to increase knowledge and capacity at Ryerson University on Indigenous issues. So part of my job has been to recruit additional instructors, researchers, students, and staff, but also to teach research and publish on Indigenous issues, and also in areas that haven't been covered before. The current political realities, the legal realities, the social justice issues that exist right in our own country. And they're everything from important constitutional issues right down to life and death, how much less of a lifespan Indigenous peoples have. And it's really important. Part of that mandate also is to look at leadership and governance, which fits in nicely with the Cura research that Wendy was talking about, but also with Ryerson in general, because Ryerson is one of those universities that's in the lead, it's in the forefront. But probably the most important part of my mandate is to expand partnership and collaboration. The fact that I have to expand, you know, partnerships and collaboration is actually just better for me, because I have no business background. I don't have an economics background. So when I'm trying to make the case for why we should be putting more funding into First Nation education, there's a huge economic component to that I don't have the background for, but half the people in this room do. And so the message that we don't have to do all of our own research ourselves is huge. It means we can benefit a lot more people on a whole bunch more issues if we collaborate. The history that goes along with education and what kinds of education that we're talking about and who's doing the education and the content. Relationships both on the state level and international stage. The research that I do takes me all over the world. So if you have international-based research too, don't think that it won't be relevant, because there's many different Indigenous nations all over the world. But the other thing is where we're jointly working to inform the media and the public and policymakers and decision makers, I think that's key. You're impacting the lives of people. Literally, you're impacting the lives of people. The kind of work and capacity and knowledge that we're sharing will make a huge difference. So hopefully you'll want to work on some of these projects. Thank you.
I wanted to start by making sure that we all had a cursory overview of the conditions under which disabled Canadians live. 14.3% of Canadians live with some kind of physical, sensory, or functional and cognitive impairment. Most Canadians report that they have that their impairment involves some kind of agility issue or pain issue. The marginal conditions under which most disabled Canadians live compared to their non-disabled peers. Our educational attainment and our income levels are lower. Our risk of being unemployed is higher. Our risk in living under the low-income cutoff is also higher. But despite this discouraging picture, I think that there are certainly signs of gains for us as well. So for instance, there's a burgeoning disability culture that we can take part of. Mainstream representations of disability have become more nuanced. We've had some very progressive policies, including the closure of large residential institutions, really in Ontario within the last 2 years, and they're still being closed across Canada. And we've had some significant human rights victories. All my projects are connected in part by my methodological orientation. So I take up the social model of disability. And that particular tool for analysis, if you will see disability not just as an inherent failing or as a functional or biological difference, but it'll look at it as a social and political relation upon which our social practices and our tacit knowledges are built. Ontario has changed the way it delivers developmental services, such that it's more centralized. And ostensibly, this is to streamline the process. This was meant to be an enabling intervention. It was meant to make things easier. Part of that enabling intervention was to also centralize the need for psychological testing, so to determine your eligibility for those services. What that meant is many people who had been tested many years past or didn't want to negotiate the psychological testing chose to opt out of psychological testing. The consequence for them is they've not been able to access developmental services. And for disabled people, that has meant, who require these services, that's meant that they find themselves without the supports that they require for housing. So they find themselves literally on the street, in shelters, in the criminal justice system, or back in institutions.
My name is Jerry Hunt, and I teach in the Ted Rogers School here at Ryerson. And for a quite long time, I've been tracking and looking at LGBT issues, particularly in Canada, but also more internationally. I mostly have looked at organized labor in Canada and how it has responded to the LGBT population. My research basically and more generally looks at the uptake of LGBT issues in organizations, so not just labor, but labor's been my selected organization, my case study to look at this issue. Some people look at LGBT more from the experience of the person. I've looked at more at it from the experience of the organization in accommodating or not accommodating this minority group. My research is kind of crosses a number of things. I've done statistical work on this, case studies, and the initial issues were often around benefits, unequal type benefit. The first publication I had around this was in 1995, and I've just tried to summarize over a period of years there. That you can see. By 1995, many unions were doing something. There was certainly activity going on. Union federations were doing something. And by 2005, I was able to say 22 unions in Canada had become active on this issue. So unions were an early take-up on this, but let us not forget unions didn't do this voluntarily either. The other big thing unions did in Canada was support almost all of the significant cases that went before provincial courts and to the Supreme Court. If you track, and in fact I have an article on this, if you track back and look at who supported those cases either by directly taking them or by financial support, unions are always there in every single one. Take any of the cases you want and they're there. The Income Tax Act one is particularly important, transformative for the country, that was led and paid for by CUPE. Insiders, I think for all diversity issues, you need activism and they need to be working from the inside out as much as possible to get things done. The other thing in LGBT is women came first. Women had established mechanisms to get a lot done in unions. LGBT benefited hugely from the early work of women.
My work focuses on diversity in fashion, and I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, diversity is not really in fashion, and you're right, because if we look at this cover of Vogue from 2009, the headline reads, "The World's Next Top Models." And as we can see, there's a very narrow, singular ideal of femininity that's produced and reproduced by the fashion industry. A tall, thin, young, able-bodied, Caucasian ideal of beauty. Interesting to note, the average female model is a size 2, is 5'10". The average Canadian woman is a size 14, is 5'4". A bit of a discrepancy. But this doesn't only affect women. This also affects men. These are images from the most recent Yves Saint Laurent show, the House of Saint Laurent, in January, the Fall-Winter 2013 collection. And as you can see, there is a very singular ideal of beauty now promoted by fashion for men, right? Quite an emaciated ideal. And it's interesting to note that 10 years ago, the average male model, his jacket size was a 40, 42, his waist was a 32, 34. Today, the jacket size is a 36, the waist is a 28, and he's still 6'2", 6'3". So again, these ideals of beauty, these singular ideals, the very exclusionary ideals, are promoted and promoted by fashion. And research has concluded that there's definitely a decrease in self-esteem, a decrease in body image, can lead to eating disorders and other negative impacts. I use the space of business and consumer culture really to try to engage with the language of industry to get them to think about diversity in a way that would speak to them. So really my research looks at this. Is there a business case for diversity in fashion? And particularly, how will consumers respond? How do consumers respond to diversity in fashion imagery? To understand the values that underpin particular responses. And so this research was done in North America on a sample of 1,500 women ranging in age from 14 to 60, and probably not that shocking, women did significantly increase purchase intentions when they saw a model who was similar to them by over 300%. But of course, fashion doesn't just occur in North America. It's a global industry. And so I extended this research to China. China was important for many reasons, but one, over 75% of models in fashion magazines are Caucasian, very different from the population. And also for the fashion industry, for our context, China is an extremely important market. And so I extended the research using the same methodological approach to China. And again, I found that there's this emerging group of Chinese women that increase purchases when models reflect them. In addition to traditional forms of dissemination, academic forms of dissemination, peer-reviewed publications and books, I also really believe in disseminating the research within industry. So I had the opportunity to write an article called The New Business Model, an essay on my work for Elle Canada last year, and it was a great opportunity to share my findings that diversity does make business sense with their readers and also with their advertisers. And in this current issue of Elle Canada, I had the opportunity to guest edit an editorial to show what my research could look like in fashion reality. This only represents 2 examples of the research that I'm doing. I'm in the School of Fashion, and we have a really active faculty engaged in research on diversity in fashion, and a very active student body engaged in research on diversity in fashion. I invite you to check out the School of Fashion website and look at the Fashion Diversity Lab. It's a new lab we started this year, specifically to look at interdisciplinary collaborations with students, with scholars, with practitioners, to engage in this research on diversity in fashion and the various intersections. So my belief for the Fashion Diversity Lab, for the work we're doing, is really to change industry, to use the influence and the power of research to give voice to consumers who are often marginalized by the fashion industry, to create a visual culture that's equitable, that's diverse, and that's inclusive.